Picture this. You're a mountain man in 1823, and you've just realized that winter has arrived 3 weeks early. Not just any winter, mind you, but the kind of Rocky Mountain winter that turns grown men into frozen statues and makes wolves fat on human bones. The kind of winter where the temperature drops so fast you can actually hear the trees cracking like gunshots in the night. Thomas Wilson knew this sound well. He'd been leading trapping expeditions into the Absaroka Range for 7 years, and he understood what those cracking trees meant. Death was coming, and it was coming fast. Now, when we talk about the American frontier, we often romanticize it. We imagine rugged individualists conquering the wilderness with nothing but grit and determination, but here's what the history books don't always tell you. Most of these men died. Not in glorious battles with hostile tribes or dramatic showdowns with grizzly bears. They died slowly, miserably, of starvation and cold, gnawing on their own leather belts while their bodies consumed themselves from the inside out. The Wilson expedition started with 23 men, 23 experienced trappers who thought they knew what they were doing. They had traditional deadfall traps, massive contraptions of logs and stones that crushed beaver and marten against the ground. These traps had worked for generations of Native Americans and decades of white trappers. But here's the thing about traditional solutions. They only work until conditions change, and conditions were changing fast. That September blizzard didn't just bring snow, it brought 6 feet of the stuff, burying every single one of their carefully placed deadfalls. Imagine spending weeks setting up intricate trap lines, only to watch them disappear under a white blanket that might not melt until May. Worse yet, the few animals they managed to catch before the snow hit were being stolen, not by other trappers, but by wolverines and wolves, who could smell blood through 3 feet of powder and dig down to claim their prize. By October, Wilson was doing math that no expedition leader ever wants to do. 23 men, each needing roughly 2 pounds of meat per day to maintain strength in sub-zero temperatures. That's 46 pounds of fresh protein daily, or about 1 elk every 3 days, assuming they could catch anything at all. Their food caches, those carefully hidden stores of jerky and pemmican that were supposed to last until spring, were running dangerously low. Some had been raided by bears preparing for hibernation. Others had simply been miscalculated. November brought the first deaths. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the slow, grinding reality of malnutrition in extreme cold. First was old Pete Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who'd been trapping these mountains since 1816. His body simply gave out one morning, shutting down like a clockwork mechanism that had finally wound down. Then came the Morrison brothers, found frozen together in their shared bedroll, too weak to maintain body heat. The survivors were reduced to eating things that would make a modern person vomit just thinking about them. Boot leather boiled until it became a gelatinous soup, pine bark stripped from trees and cooked into a bitter porridge that provided almost no nutrition but filled empty stomachs with something, anything, to quiet the gnawing hunger. Some men tried eating their own hair, others chewed on pieces of their clothing. Wilson was facing a calculation that would haunt any leader. At their current rate of consumption and with their current success rate at hunting, maybe 5 men would see spring. Maybe. The rest would join old Pete and the Morrison brothers in shallow graves that wouldn't be properly dug until the ground thawed. That's when young Jedediah Coulter stumbled into camp. Now, Coulter was barely 20 years old, the kind of eager kid who'd joined the expedition, dreaming of adventure and fortune. But the man who crawled into their firelight that November night looked like he'd aged a decade in a week. His face was black with frostbite, his hands wrapped in bloody rags, and his eyes held the particular kind of wildness that comes from seeing things that shouldn't exist. For 3 days, Coulter raved about what he'd found during his solo scouting mission. He spoke of smoke rising from pristine snow where no smoke should be, of strange wooden contraptions holding deer and elk suspended high above the drifts like some kind of primitive gallows, of an old man with pale blue eyes who moved through blizzards like he was taking a summer stroll. The other trappers thought Coulter had lost his mind. Hypothermia and starvation can do that to a man, make him see things, believe things that aren't there. But Wilson noticed something in the boy's ravings that made him listen more carefully. Coulter wasn't talking about mirages or hallucinations. He was describing specific mechanical details: bent trees under tension, precise trigger mechanisms. A system. The Crow Indians had a name for this mysterious figure: Winter Fox. According to tribal stories, he was a white trapper who'd gone native so completely that he'd forgotten how to die. The few trappers who claimed to have encountered him called him Mad Sam Bridger, though most considered him more legend than man. But Coulter had seen his traps, had seen fresh elk meat hanging in the middle of a blizzard, while 23 civilized men starved just valleys away. Wilson made a decision that probably saved his life and changed the course of American frontier history. He selected 5 of his strongest men, loaded them with their last week of provisions, and sent them into the howling wilderness to find this Samuel Bridger. It was the kind of desperate gamble that only makes sense when all other options lead to certain death. What those 5 men discovered in that snow cave would revolutionize not just trapping, but the entire relationship between humans and the North American wilderness. But first, they had to survive the journey through what the mountain men called the White Death, MMD, where temperatures dropped so low that spit froze before it hit the ground, and where one wrong step could mean the difference between finding salvation and becoming another cautionary tale whispered around distant campfires. The question wasn't whether they would find Mad Sam Bridger, the question was whether they would find him in time, and whether a hermit who'd chosen solitude over civilization would bother to save 5 desperate strangers from the winter that was already claiming their souls. When those 5 desperate men finally found Samuel Bridger's cave, they thought they'd stumbled into another world entirely. Imagine crawling through a blizzard for 3 days, your beard frozen to your chest, your fingers so numb you can't feel the rifle in your hands, expecting to find either salvation or your own grave. Then you see it. A thin wisp of smoke rising from what looks like solid snow, not the thick, choking smoke of green wood burned by desperate men, but the clean, steady smoke of someone who actually knows what they're doing. The entrance to Bridger's cave was so perfectly concealed that they walked past it twice. When they finally found the narrow opening behind a screen of ice-covered pine boughs, what they discovered inside defied everything they thought they knew about wilderness survival. The walls weren't rough rock or hastily dug earth. They were smooth as glass, carved and shaped with the patience of a man who had nothing but time. Alcoves were cut into the walls at precise intervals, each one holding strange wooden mechanisms that looked like the work of some frontier clockmaker. And hanging from the ceiling, dear God, dear fresh elk meat, massive haunches and ribs, preserved in nature's own freezer, while 23 men starved just valleys away. But it was the man himself who truly shocked them. Samuel Bridger was 60 years old, though he moved like someone half that age. His hair and beard had gone completely white, but his pale blue eyes held the kind of clarity that comes from years of seeing things exactly as they are, without the comfortable lies that civilization tells itself. When he looked at these 5 desperate visitors, he was reading them the way a hunter reads tracks in snow, calculating their strength, their desperation, their chances of survival. And then he spoke his first words to another human being in 3 years. Your traps think like men, but winter thinks like death itself. Now, you have to understand something about mountain men. These were proud individuals who'd survived where others had died, who'd learned their trade from veterans, who'd learned it from Native Americans, who'd been perfecting it for generations. They didn't take kindly to criticism from hermits, even hermits who clearly had fresh meat when they had none. But hunger has a way of making men humble. Over the next 3 days, Bridger revealed his revolutionary system not through long explanations or detailed lectures, but through demonstration. He was a teacher who believed in showing rather than telling, probably because he'd forgotten how to waste words during his years of solitude. The basic principle was so simple it was almost insulting. Where traditional deadfalls used weight to crush prey against the ground, Bridger's traps used the forest's own strength to lift prey into the air. He'd identified young pines and firs with the right combination of flexibility and strength, then bent them nearly double using intricate systems of cordage made from sinew and inner bark. Picture a sapling pine about 6 inches in diameter and 20 feet tall. In nature, these trees can bend remarkably far without breaking. They have to survive Rocky Mountain windstorms and heavy snow loads. Bridger had learned to calculate exactly how far each tree could bend, then secure it at that maximum tension using cordage systems that would make a ship's rigger weep with envy. The trigger mechanisms were works of art in their own right. Not the crude notched stick triggers that most trappers used, but precise constructions that could support the weight of a 700-pound elk while remaining sensitive enough to release when a rabbit brushed against them. Each trigger was custom-built for its intended prey, carved from specific types of wood that Bridger had tested over years of experimentation. When an animal stepped into the snare loop and triggered the mechanism, that bent sapling would snap upward with tremendous force, hauling the catch completely clear of the snow. No more digging through drifts to find crushed carcasses. No more losing hard-won meat to scavengers who could smell blood through 3 feet of powder. The starving trappers initially resisted learning the system. Their pride was wounded by the simplicity of what they'd missed, by the realization that they'd been thinking about the problem all wrong. They'd been fighting winter instead of working with it. They'd been imposing their will on the forest instead of asking the forest to help them survive. But when Bridger demonstrated his largest trap, a massive construction that hauled a 700-pound elk bull 8 feet into the air as easily as a man might lift a sack of flour, their resistance crumbled like ice in spring. Working by firelight, wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, the men learned to read trees the way Bridger read them, not just as sources of wood or shelter, but as potential partners in the business of survival. They learned to calculate bend ratios, to test flexibility without breaking, to weave cordage that would hold under tremendous stress but release at exactly the right moment. The selection process alone was an education. Bridger could look at a grove of saplings and immediately identify which ones had the right characteristics. Too thick, and they wouldn't bend far enough. Too thin, and they'd snap under load. Too old, and the wood would be brittle. Too young, and they'd lack the strength to lift heavy game. Then came the mathematics of tension and leverage. How to secure a bent tree so it would hold for weeks or months without losing power. How to position the snare loop at exactly the right height and angle. How to camouflage the entire contraption so it looked like nothing more than natural forest growth. Within a week, they had meat. Real meat, not the leather soup and pine bark porridge they'd been choking down. Within 2 weeks, they had surplus. And within a month, they understood that they weren't just learning a new trapping technique. They were learning an entirely different way of thinking about survival. Instead of imposing human will on an hostile environment, they were discovering how to become partners with the wilderness itself. Instead of fighting winter, they were learning to dance with it. But even as these 5 men mastered Bridger's system, the hermit himself remained an enigma. He'd saved their lives, certainly, but his motives remained unclear. Was he simply a lonely old man grateful for human company? Was he testing whether civilized trappers could learn to think like the wilderness itself? Or was he planning something larger? Something that would transform not just how men survived in the mountains, but how they understood their place in the vast, unforgiving, magnificent wilderness that stretched from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean? Word travels fast in the mountains, especially word about survival. When the Wilson expedition stumbled into the 1824 rendezvous at Henry's Fork, they looked like men who'd seen the face of God and lived to tell about it. 23 men had entered the Absaroka Range the previous fall. 19 came out alive, an almost unheard-of survival rate for a winter that had killed trappers across the entire Rocky Mountain region. But it wasn't just that they'd survived. They were thriving. Their pack animals were loaded with prime pelts. Their faces were full instead of gaunt, and most shocking of all, they were eager to head back into the mountains for another season. In a business where 70% winter mortality was considered normal, this was nothing short of miraculous. The rendezvous at Henry's Fork was the Kentucky Derby, Super Bowl, and New York Stock Exchange of the Mountain West all rolled into one chaotic celebration. 800 mountain men, traders, Native Americans, and company agents gathered for 2 weeks of trading, storytelling, drinking, gambling, and planning for the year ahead. These weren't just business meetings. They were the only chance most of these men had to see other human beings outside their small trapping brigades. When Wilson's men began demonstrating what they called Bridger's salvation design, the entire character of the rendezvous changed. Picture this scene. A crowd of hardened veterans, men who'd lost fingers to frostbite and friends to starvation, watching in stunned silence as a simple bent sapling lifted a full-grown deer 8 feet into the air. These were people who thought they knew everything there was to know about staying alive in the wilderness, suddenly realizing they'd been doing it all wrong. The initial reaction was skepticism, of course. Mountain men didn't survive by trusting new ideas, especially ideas that seemed too good to be true. But when Hugh Glass himself, the legendary bear-mauled survivor who'd crawled 300 miles to safety, publicly endorsed the system, skepticism turned to intense interest. Glass had lost more men to winter starvation than any other brigade leader, and he understood better than anyone what the spring pole design could mean. "This isn't just about trapping," he announced to the gathered crowd. "This is about whether the mountains belong to us or we belong to the mountains." But then, the American Fur Company agents stepped in, and everything got complicated. Corporate interests had been trying to monopolize the fur trade for years, buying out independent trappers and imposing company discipline on what had traditionally been a fiercely individualistic business. When they saw Bridger's design, they didn't see a life-saving innovation. They saw a competitive advantage that could be owned, controlled, and exploited. The company agents moved quickly, offering to buy exclusive rights to what they officially termed the Bridger Patent Wilderness Survival System. They promised gold payments, guaranteed supply contracts, and winter employment for any trapper willing to sign over his right to use or teach the spring pole technique. The free trappers' response was immediate and unanimous. Absolutely not. Led by Hugh Glass and backed by the Wilson expedition survivors, they declared that no man should own the means of another's survival. The knowledge belonged to the mountains themselves, they argued, discovered through partnership with the wilderness rather than conquest of it. To patent such knowledge would be like claiming ownership of the wind or the snow. This wasn't just philosophical disagreement, it was a fundamental conflict between two different visions of how Americans should relate to their continent. The company vision saw the wilderness as a resource to be extracted, controlled, and monetized. The free trapper vision saw it as a partner to be understood, respected, and learned from. The trappers won, but not through politics or legal maneuvering. They won through the simple act of sharing knowledge faster than any company could contain it. By summer's end, trappers had adapted Bridger's basic principle for every conceivable situation. Smaller versions for rabbits and martens, using willow switches and grass cord, massive constructions for bear and moose, requiring teams of men to bend trees thick as a man's waist, ingenious variations for different forest types, desert adaptations using Joshua trees and yucca fiber, prairie versions using buffalo sinew and carefully selected cottonwoods along creek beds. The Crow and Shoshone tribes, initially amused to see white men finally discovering principles their ancestors had known in different forms for generations, began actively contributing improvements. They taught the trappers how to create superior cordage from specific plants gathered at precise times of year. They shared subtle refinements in trigger design that increased success rates even further. They revealed camouflage techniques that made the traps virtually invisible to both prey and competing trappers. What emerged wasn't just a new trapping method, it was a new culture of knowledge sharing that crossed racial and tribal boundaries. For the first time, white trappers were learning from Native Americans not as a matter of desperate survival, but as equals engaged in perfecting a shared craft. The results were staggering. Winter mortality among isolated trappers plummeted from 70% to 20% within just 2 years. Territories that had been considered too dangerous for winter trapping suddenly became viable. The economic geography of the entire fur trade shifted as trappers pushed into previously unreachable valleys and established permanent winter camps in locations where others had always died. But the transformation went deeper than mere survival statistics. Trapping brigades developed entirely new organizational structures around trapline management. Instead of competing individuals scattered across vast territories, they became cooperative teams, maintaining complex systems of interconnected trap lines. They established supply caches and emergency shelters positioned to support the new technology. They created an informal apprenticeship system where experienced practitioners taught newcomers not just the mechanics of the traps, but the deeper skills of reading terrain, understanding animal behavior, and thinking like the forest itself. The spring pole revolution also changed the relationship between trappers and the landscape. Traditional deadfall trapping had been extractive, take what you can get and move on before the area is depleted. The new system encouraged long-term stewardship. Trappers became invested in maintaining healthy game populations, protecting the young trees they depended on, and understanding the ecological rhythms that made their partnerships with the wilderness sustainable. Yet even as his innovation revolutionized frontier life, Samuel Bridger himself remained elusive. Trappers reported occasional sightings, a white-bearded figure at the edge of firelight, observing demonstrations of his technique before vanishing back into the wilderness. Some claimed he was testing them, evaluating whether civilized men could truly learn to think like the mountains. Others believed he was simply a ghost, a legend that had taken on a life of its own. But the journals would tell a different story. The journals that wouldn't be discovered for another 43 years, hidden in an abandoned cave system that held secrets about not just how the spring pole trap was invented, but why it mattered so much more than anyone realized. The revolution was spreading, but the revolutionary himself was about to disappear forever into the white silence that had made him. Samuel Bridger walked into a March blizzard in 1827 and simply vanished from history. The last confirmed sighting came from a crow hunting party, who spotted him moving through a whiteout storm that had grounded every other living thing for miles. They described a figure walking upright through snow that was falling so thick you couldn't see your own hands, moving with the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going. When the storm cleared 3 days later, they found his tracks leading toward the high peaks, ATA, and then nothing. No body was ever recovered. No final camp was discovered. Mad Sam Bridger had become what the crow always said he was, a creature of winter itself, returning to the white silence that had shaped him. But his legacy was just beginning to transform a continent. By 1827, variations of the spring pole trap had enabled something unprecedented in American frontier history, ASL, the permanent settlement of territories that had previously been seasonal death traps. The Oregon Trail, that great highway of westward expansion, became viable partly because trappers using Bridger's techniques had established reliable supply stations in previously unsurvivable locations. Winter trading posts sprouted in valleys where earlier expeditions had found only frozen corpses and abandoned camps. The economic impact was staggering, though it wouldn't be fully understood until decades later. Historians calculate that the 70% reduction in winter trapper mortality added over $12 million annually to the American economy by 1840, an enormous sum in an era when a skilled craftsman earned $300 per year. More importantly, the geographic expansion, enabled by year-round trapping operations, secured American territorial claims against British and Russian competitors, who were still losing men to traditional survival methods. But the deeper transformation was cultural. The spring pole revolution had fundamentally altered the relationship between American settlers and the North American wilderness. Instead of seeing the frontier as something to be conquered through superior firepower and determination, trappers had learned to see it as a partner to be understood and worked with. This shift in thinking would influence everything from railroad construction to agricultural techniques as the frontier continued expanding westward. The mystery of Samuel Bridger himself might have remained forever unsolved, if not for pure chance and a persistent Smithsonian researcher named Dr. Margaret Whitfield. In 1871, Whitfield was leading an expedition to catalogue geological formations in the Absaroka Range when a sudden rockslide exposed a cave system that had been sealed for decades. What they found inside changed everything historians thought they knew about the spring pole revolution. Bridger's journals filled 17 leather-bound volumes, written in a precise hand that remained steady even during his final winter alone. But these weren't just technical manuals or survival guides. They were the philosophical reflections of a man who had spent 8 years perfecting not just a trapping technique, but an entirely different way of understanding humanity's place in the natural world. The journals revealed the true origin story that Samuel Bridger had never shared with those desperate trappers who found him in 1823. In 1815, Bridger had been a conventional trapper, successful but unremarkable, working the beaver streams of the upper Missouri with methods passed down through generations of mountain men. Then, a late-season blizzard caught him alone and unprepared, just another statistic waiting to happen. He should have died. Would have died, except for an elderly Shoshone woman named Winter Moon who found him half-frozen beside a dead campfire, delirious with hypothermia, and talking to people who weren't there. She brought him to her family's winter camp, nursed him back to health, and in return for his life, taught him the basic principles that would eventually become the spring pole system. But here's what makes the story remarkable. Bridger didn't just learn her techniques and move on. He spent the next 8 years obsessing over the underlying principles, testing variations, perfecting mechanisms, and most importantly, thinking deeply about what it meant to truly partner with the wilderness instead of fighting against it. His journals contained not just technical drawings, but philosophical reflections that read like the work of a frontier Thoreau. "The forest teaches patience to those who listen," he wrote, "but only impatience to those who demand." And later, "A man who takes only what the land offers freely will never starve, but a man who takes what the land guards jealously will never be satisfied." Most revealing of all was his final entry, dated March 15, 1827, just days before his disappearance. "The knowledge spreads like spring melt, carrying life to places that knew only death. My part is finished. The mountains call me home." The economic calculations that emerged from studying his journals were staggering. By 1871, techniques derived from Bridger's innovations had enabled the establishment of over 200 permanent settlements in previously unsurvivable territories. The reduction in winter mortality had allowed American trappers to maintain year-round presence in disputed territories, effectively securing what would become Montana, Wyoming, and northern Colorado against foreign claims. But perhaps more importantly, the Spring Pole Revolution had established a template for how Americans could relate to their continent, not as conquerors imposing their will, but as students learning to work with natural systems. This philosophy would influence conservation movements, agricultural innovations, and even urban planning as the nation continued expanding. Modern wilderness survival schools still teach Bridger's principles, though few instructors understand the cultural revolution they represent. In an age of GPS beacons and satellite phones, wilderness guides still carry cordage and know how to read the bend of a sapling. They're carrying forward the legacy of a man who chose solitude over civilization, but ended up saving countless lives through the simple act of paying attention to what the forest was trying to teach. Today, when we talk about sustainable living and working with natural systems instead of against them, we're echoing ideas that Samuel Bridger perfected in a snow cave 44 years before the word ecology was even coined. His revolution wasn't just about trapping techniques. It was about learning to think like the wilderness itself. The winter fox had vanished into legend, but his lesson lived on. Sometimes the difference between survival and death isn't about being stronger or smarter than nature. Sometimes it's about being humble enough to let nature teach you how to live.